When Hurricane Delilah turned toward the Louisiana coast with winds that could rip houses from their foundations, most people had already fled inland. But Elena Rodriguez was still there, trapped in a nightmare that no evacuation plan could have prepared her for. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest storms, and that a single moment of human kindness can rewrite 2 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the abandoned gas station like bullets, each drop driven by winds that screamed through the empty streets of Bayou Haven. Elena pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, her 4-year-old son Jamie clutched tight against her chest, his small body shaking with each labored breath. The inhaler she'd been rationing for weeks was empty now, just a useless piece of plastic in her trembling hands. She had tried everything. The evacuation buses had been full when she finally made it to the pickup point, dragging Jamie through flooded streets as his breathing got worse and worse. The emergency shelters were turning people away, and when she heard them asking for identification papers, for documentation she didn't have, Elena had grabbed her son and run back into the storm. Better to face the hurricane than face deportation. While Jamie struggled to breathe. Now 12 hours later, she was watching her little boy die in her arms. Jamie's lips were turning blue, the same terrifying color they'd turned 3 months ago when the asthma attack nearly killed him. But this time, there was no hospital to run to, no emergency room that would take them in despite her lack of insurance. The storm had cut off everything, turned the world into a howling maze of water and wind and darkness. Even if she could find help, even if someone would listen to her broken English and understand what was happening, the flooded roads were impassable now. The gas station's roof groaned overhead, metal straining against metal as the hurricane tried to tear it away. Water seeped through cracks in the walls, pooling around her feet as she rocked Jamie gently, whispering the same Spanish lullaby her grandmother had sung to her. His chest rose and fell in quick, desperate gasps, each breath a fight he was slowly losing. Elena had left everything behind to give Jamie a better life. She'd crossed borders and worked jobs that paid nothing, lived in rooms without heat, saved every dollar for his medicine and doctor visits. All of it so he could grow up healthy and strong, so he could have the chances she never did. But now, as she felt his small body going limp in her arms, she wondered if she'd brought him all this way just to watch him slip away in a storm. The wind outside shifted, howling like something alive and hungry. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see trees bent nearly horizontal, their branches whipping through the air like weapons. A street sign flew past, tumbling end over end before disappearing into the gray chaos. The storm surge had already claimed the lower part of town, turning familiar streets into rivers that rushed toward the Gulf with deadly force. Jamie's breathing grew shallower. His eyes, usually bright with curiosity and mischief, were glazed and unfocused. Elena felt her own chest tighten with panic as she pressed her ear to his ribs, listening to the awful wheeze that meant his airways were closing. She'd heard that sound too many times, knew exactly what it meant, but tonight there was nothing she could do to stop it. She pulled out her cell phone with shaking fingers, hoping against hope for a signal, for any connection to the outside world. The screen showed nothing but static where the service bars should be. The hurricane had knocked out the cell towers hours ago, cutting off the last thread that might have connected her to help. Even 911 was unreachable now, lost somewhere in the storm's electronic chaos. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it shook the building's frame and sent dust raining down from the ceiling. Elena flinched, holding Jamie closer, feeling his heart beating against her chest like a bird trapped in a cage. Too fast, too irregular, fighting for every beat just like his lungs fought for every breath. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt, and fever, and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The abandoned gas station felt like the end of the world, cut off from everything that might have saved them. Outside, Hurricane Delilah raged with the fury of nature unleashed, turning their small coastal town into a battlefield where survival was measured in minutes. And inside, a mother held her dying child and prayed to whatever gods might still be listening, begging for a miracle that seemed as impossible as stopping the storm itself. But sometimes, in the darkest moments when hope seems lost forever, the impossible finds a way to break through. The emergency radio crackled through the cab of the ambulance as Marcus Thompson navigated another flooded street, his headlights cutting through the driving rain like weak flashlights in a cave. Dispatch had gone quiet 20 minutes ago, their last transmission cutting off mid-sentence when the main communication tower finally succumbed to Delilah's fury. Now he was running solo, following his gut and 15 years of emergency response. Experience through a city that looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Marcus shouldn't have been out here at all. Protocol demanded that emergency vehicles return to base once sustained winds hit 80 miles per hour, but he'd volunteered for one last sweep of the evacuation zone before the hurricane made rescue impossible. His supervisor had argued with him, practically begged him to head inland with the rest of the crew. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, still waiting for help that might never come. Maybe it was because of Sarah and the kids. Maybe it was because he'd spent the last 6 months watching his own family slip away, powerless to stop his marriage from crumbling despite everything he'd tried. When your 8-year-old daughter asks why daddy doesn't live at home anymore, when your wife looks at you like you're a stranger who happens to share her last name, you start thinking about the people you can still save, the ones who still need you. The ambulance lurched as he hit a pothole hidden beneath 2 feet of murky water. His medical supplies rattled in their compartments behind him, secured but shifting with each impact. He'd loaded extra oxygen tanks before heading out, plus every inhaler and breathing treatment he could carry. Hurricane evacuations always left behind the most vulnerable people, the ones who couldn't get out on their own. And respiratory emergencies spiked during major storms when stress and poor air quality pushed weak lungs past their breaking point. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His radio sputtered to life with fragments of distant chatter, voices fading in and out like ghosts. Emergency crews from 3 parishes over, probably, their signals bouncing off the storm clouds in ways that made no meteorological sense. He caught pieces of conversations about collapsed bridges, about neighborhoods completely underwater, about casualties they couldn't reach. The scope of what Delilah was doing to the Gulf Coast was becoming clear, and it was worse than anyone had predicted. Marcus turned down Riverside Avenue, or what used to be Riverside Avenue before the storm surge turned it into an actual river. The water here was moving fast, carrying debris that ranged from lawn furniture to pieces of houses, all of it flowing toward the Gulf with the inevitability of gravity. His ambulance could handle maybe another 6 inches before the engine started. Taking on water, which gave him a narrow window to complete this final sweep and get back to higher ground. The abandoned businesses along this stretch told the story of a community that had fled in stages. Some storefronts were boarded up properly, their windows protected by plywood painted with messages of hope and defiance. Others showed signs of hasty departure, doors left ajar, contents scattered by wind and rising water. A few buildings had already taken serious damage, their roofs peeled back like opened cans, their interiors exposed to the hurricane's merciless attention. That's when his headlights caught the gas station. It sat on a slight rise that had kept it maybe a foot above the worst flooding, its concrete structure intact, despite the punishment Delilah had been dealing out all night. The canopy over the pumps had partially collapsed, twisted metal hanging at dangerous angles, but the main building looked solid. More importantly, Marcus could see a faint light inside. Not electric, but flickering like a phone screen or emergency flashlight. He pulled the ambulance as close as he could manage, parking at an angle that would protect the driver's side from the worst of the wind. The rain hit him like a physical blow when he opened the door, each drop driven with enough force to sting. Exposed skin. He grabbed his medical bag and a portable oxygen unit, then fought his way through the storm toward what he hoped was another human being who still needed help. The glass doors of the gas station were locked, but through the rain-streaked windows he could see movement inside. A figure hunched against the far wall, too small to be an adult, but too large to be alone. His emergency training kicked in as he pounded on the glass, shouting over the wind, trying to make himself heard over nature's overwhelming noise. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and aimed it through the window, the beam revealing what his worst fears had suggested. A young woman, Latino, probably mid-20s, holding a small child who wasn't moving the way healthy children move. Even from outside, even through glass and rain and darkness, he could see the telltale signs of respiratory distress. The child's positioning, the mother's desperate posture, the way she held him like he might slip away if she loosened her grip for even a second. He'd seen this scenario too many times before, usually in hospital emergency rooms where help was readily available. But tonight, in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane, with every normal resource cut off or overwhelmed, this woman was watching her child die with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. Marcus tried the door again, then moved along the building's perimeter, looking for another way in. The employee entrance and back was secured with a deadbolt, but the frame had been weakened by water damage. He put his shoulder against it, using the leverage and adrenaline that came with 15 years of breaking down barriers between himself and people who needed help. The door gave way with a crack that was lost in the hurricane's roar. Elena heard the door splinter behind her and spun around, clutching Jamie so tightly against her chest that he let out a weak whimper. Through the darkness, she saw a large silhouette in the doorway, water dripping from what looked like a uniform, carrying equipment she couldn't identify. Her heart hammered against her ribs as every survival instinct she'd developed over the past 3 years in America screamed the same warning: run! The figure stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket, and Elena pressed herself further into the corner where she'd been hiding. In the dim light from her dying phone, she could make out enough details to confirm her worst fears. The uniform was dark blue with patches and reflective strips, official-looking in the way that meant trouble for someone like her. The equipment bag slung over his shoulder was medical, which could only mean one thing. Someone had reported them, had seen her struggling with Jamie, and called the authorities. Marcus raised his hand slowly, recognizing the universal language of a cornered animal protecting its young. He'd seen this reaction before, usually in domestic situations where trust had been shattered by violence or trauma. But this felt different, more complex than simple fear of strangers. The woman's eyes held a wariness that spoke to deeper wounds, the kind that came from systematic betrayal by institutions that were supposed to help. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Immigration enforcement often worked with local emergency services, sharing information and coordinating raids. If this man was truly a paramedic, he would be required to check identification, to verify insurance coverage, to ask questions that Elena couldn't answer without revealing her status. Even if he helped Jamie now, even if he saved her son's life, the paperwork would follow. The reports would be filed. And within days, maybe hours, men in different uniforms would come to take them both away. She shifted Jamie to one arm and fumbled for the broken piece of metal she'd found earlier, a sharp fragment from the damaged canopy outside. Her Spanish was quick and desperate as she whispered to her unconscious son, promising him she wouldn't let anyone separate them, that Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The words came out in a rush that she knew the man couldn't understand, but she needed to say them anyway. Marcus caught the glint of metal in her hand and immediately stopped moving forward. His training told him to establish verbal contact, to identify himself clearly and explain his intentions, but something about her posture suggested that official protocols might make things worse. Instead, he slowly lowered himself into a crouch, making himself less imposing while keeping his medical bag within reach. Elena watched him carefully, noting how he moved with deliberate slowness, how he kept his hands visible, how he didn't demand immediate compliance the way most authority figures did. But she'd learned not to trust initial impressions. Immigration raids often began with officers who seemed reasonable, who spoke softly and made promises they had no intention of keeping. They would lie about their intentions, claim they were only there to help, right up until the moment they produced the handcuffs and the deportation orders. The storm raged outside with renewed intensity, as if Delilah had been gathering strength for this particular assault. Wind hammered against the building's walls with enough force to make the entire structure shudder, while rain found every crack and weakness in the roof, creating a steady percussion of drips and leaks. The sound provided cover for Elena's movements. As she slowly worked her way along the wall, searching for another exit that didn't require getting past the uniformed man, Marcus could see the child's distress even from his position near the door. The boy's breathing was clearly labored, his skin tone suggesting oxygen deprivation, his overall stillness indicating a medical emergency that was progressing rapidly toward crisis. Every instinct he'd developed over 15 years of emergency medicine demanded immediate intervention, but the mother's defensive posture made it clear that approaching too quickly would only escalate the situation. Elena's phone finally died, its weak light fading to black and leaving them in near total darkness, broken only by occasional lightning flashes that illuminated the gas station's interior in stark, dramatic snapshots. In those brief moments of visibility, she could see the man more clearly. His face wasn't the hard, predatory expression she'd come to associate with enforcement officers. Instead, he looked genuinely concerned, almost desperate, like someone who was fighting his own internal battle. But concern could be faked. Desperation could be manufactured. Elena had seen immigration officers who were genuinely sorry to be breaking up families, who spoke about doing their jobs with real regret in their voices. Their sympathy didn't make the handcuffs any less tight or the deportation any less final. The system they represented didn't care about individual compassion when it came to people like her, people who existed in the shadows because they'd committed the crime of loving their children enough to seek better lives for them. Marcus pulled out a small flashlight and aimed it at the floor between them, providing illumination without shining it directly in their faces. In the soft glow, he could see mother and child more clearly, and what he saw made his chest tighten with professional alarm. The boy was in serious respiratory distress, possibly minutes away from complete respiratory failure. The blue tinge around his lips suggested severe hypoxia, while his limp posture indicated that he was using all his remaining energy just to breathe. Elena saw him looking at Jamie and instinctively turned her body to shield her son from view. She'd learned to read the expressions of medical professionals, to recognize the moment when they realized the extent of Jamie's condition and started making calculations about treatment costs and insurance coverage. This man's face showed the same clinical assessment she'd seen before, the same professional evaluation that usually led to uncomfortable questions about payment and documentation. The metal fragment felt slippery in her wet palm, but she gripped it tighter anyway. Not because she thought she could fight her way out of this situation, but because holding it gave her some illusion of control in a moment where everything seemed to be spiraling beyond her reach. If this man tried to separate her from Jamie, tried to take her son away while he was struggling to breathe, she would make him understand that she wouldn't go quietly. Marcus heard her whisper something in Spanish, her voice cracked with exhaustion and terror. He'd picked up enough of the language working in Louisiana emergency services to recognize the cadence of prayer, the desperate rhythm of someone bargaining with God or fate or anyone who might be listening. The sound cut through his professional detachment and reminded him why he'd become a paramedic in the first place, back when saving lives seemed like the most important thing anyone could do with their time. But saving this child's life meant getting past a mother who saw him as a threat rather than help, who had good reasons to fear what his uniform represented, who was prepared to fight him rather than trust him with her son's care. Marcus slowly reached into his medical bag, moving with the exaggerated care of someone defusing a bomb. His flashlight beam caught the inhaler clutched in Elena's free hand, the empty plastic shell that told him everything he needed to know about what they were dealing with. Severe asthma, probably triggered by the storm's atmospheric pressure changes and the stress of their situation. The child needed bronchodilators immediately, but more than that, he needed oxygen supplementation to counteract the hypoxia that was slowly shutting down his system. Elena watched his hands like a hawk, ready to strike if he produced anything that looked like restraints or communication devices. Instead, he pulled out a small blue device that she didn't recognize, something compact and medical-looking that fit in his palm. He held it up slowly, making sure she could see it clearly in the flashlight's glow, then spoke for the first time since entering the building. "Albuterol," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm, "for breathing." The English word meant nothing to Elena, but the way he held the device, the gentle tone of his voice, and most importantly, the fact that he'd recognized Jamie's inhaler suggested this wasn't an immigration raid. Real enforcement officers wouldn't carry specialized medical equipment, wouldn't know to look for respiratory distress symptoms, wouldn't waste time on treatment when their job was detention and removal. This man was looking at Jamie the way doctors looked at him, with professional assessment rather than bureaucratic calculation. Marcus activated the nebulizer, a portable battery-powered unit designed for exactly these kinds of emergency situations. The device hummed to life with a soft mechanical sound that was almost lost in the hurricane's roar. A fine mist began emerging from the chamber, carrying medication that could open Jamie's constricted airways and buy them time to get to proper medical care. He'd loaded it with a combination of albuterol and ipratropium, the standard emergency cocktail for severe asthma attacks. Elena heard Jamie make a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and felt his body shift against her chest. For the first time in hours, he seemed to be responding to something in his environment. She looked down at his face, illuminated by the flashlight's reflection, and saw his eyelids flutter. Not opening, not fully conscious, but showing signs of awareness that had been absent since the attack reached its peak. Marcus knew he had maybe 30 seconds before the mother's protective instincts kicked back in, and she decided his presence was too dangerous to tolerate. He needed to prove his intentions quickly and clearly, in a way that transcended language, barriers, and cultural mistrust. Moving slowly, he placed the nebulizer on the floor exactly halfway between them, close enough for her to reach but far enough away that he couldn't grab her if she came for it. Elena stared at the device, watching the mist rise from its chamber like incense from an altar. She'd seen similar equipment in hospital emergency rooms, knew it was designed to deliver medication directly to the lungs, but she'd never been able to afford the portable versions. Jamie's doctors had always recommended having one for emergencies, but the cost was beyond her reach, even with the payment plans they'd offered. Insurance wouldn't cover durable medical equipment for pre-existing conditions, especially not for patients whose documentation status raised red flags in billing departments. The storm chose that moment to unleash another wave of fury, rattling the building's frame and sending a fresh cascade of water through the damaged roof. Lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. In the electrical burst of light, Elena saw Marcus clearly for the first time. His face was younger than she'd expected, marked by exhaustion, and stress but lacking the cold professionalism of enforcement officers. His uniform was soaked through, suggesting he'd been fighting the storm for hours, and his medical bag showed signs of heavy use. Marcus watched her internal struggle play out across her features. Fear warring with hope, maternal protection battling against medical necessity, years of learned caution confronting the immediate reality of a child in crisis. He'd seen this same conflict in other emergency situations, usually involving domestic violence victims, who couldn't decide whether to trust the help being offered or assume it was another form of trap. Elena looked down at Jamie again, noting how his breathing had become even more labored since the lightning illuminated the space. His chest was barely moving now, each inhalation requiring enormous effort that his small body was struggling to sustain. The blue tinge around his lips was spreading, creeping toward his fingernails in a way that she recognized from previous attacks. They were running out of time, and the empty inhaler in her hand was useless against what was happening to him. Marcus pulled out a small piece of paper and a pen, then wrote something quickly in block letters. He held it up for her to see. No police, nitrogen monoxide reports, just help. Below that, he drew a simple picture of an adult figure helping a smaller figure, then added arrows pointing to the nebulizer. His artistic skills were limited, but the message was clear enough to transcend language barriers. Elena read the words twice, trying to process what they meant. Most officials couldn't make promises about police involvement, couldn't guarantee that reports wouldn't be filed, couldn't commit to keeping medical emergencies off the books. But this man was making those promises in writing, creating evidence that could be used against him if he was lying. Either he was taking enormous professional risks to help them, or he was operating outside normal channels entirely. Jamie's breathing grew shallower, each exhale followed by a longer pause before the next inhalation began. Elena felt his heartbeat against her chest, irregular and too fast, fighting to compensate for the oxygen his lungs couldn't process. She'd memorized these warning signs over 4 years of asthma attacks, knew exactly how much time they had before his system started shutting down completely. Marcus saw her wavering and made one final gesture. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a small photograph that he held up to the flashlight. 2 children, a boy and a girl around Jamie's age, smiling at the camera with the uninhibited joy that only comes with complete trust in the adults protecting them. His own kids, separated from him by divorce proceedings and custody arrangements, but still the reason he understood exactly what this mother was going through. Elena looked at the photograph, then at the nebulizer still misting on the floor. Between them, then back at Jamie's face. Her son's lips were now distinctly blue, his skin taking on the waxy pallor that meant his body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve core organs. She had perhaps minutes before the decision would be taken out of her hands entirely. The metal fragments slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Marcus heard it fall and knew something fundamental had shifted. Moving with careful deliberation, he slid the nebulizer closer to her, keeping his hands visible and his movements predictable. Elena reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as they closed around the device that might save her son's life. Elena's fingers closed around the nebulizer with the desperate grip of someone grasping the last rope over a cliff. The device felt foreign in her hands, heavier than she'd expected, its plastic surface still warm from whatever mechanisms powered it. She could feel the gentle vibration as it continued producing the fine mist that might save Jamie's life, but holding it and knowing how to use it were 2 entirely different challenges. Marcus watched her cradle the medical device like something precious and fragile, her eyes darting between its unfamiliar controls and her son's deteriorating condition. He could see the questions forming in her mind, the same desperate uncertainty that gripped every parent when their child's life depended on technology they didn't understand. His 15 years of emergency medicine had taught him that the most advanced equipment in the world was useless if the people who needed it didn't know how to operate it properly. Elena lifted the nebulizer toward Jamie's face, then hesitated, her hand trembling with exhaustion and fear. She'd watched respiratory therapists use similar devices during their hospital visits, had seen the plastic masks pressed gently over children's noses and mouths, but she'd never administered the treatment herself. The doctors had always handled the technical aspects while she focused on holding Jamie still and keeping him calm. Now, with no medical professionals to guide her, she was terrified of making a mistake that could hurt him worse. Marcus saw her uncertainty and slowly raised his own hands, positioning them as if he were holding an invisible mask. He demonstrated the proper placement, showing her how the device should cover both nose and mouth, how to create a seal without pressing too hard against delicate facial features. His movements were exaggerated and deliberate, designed to be understood across language barriers and cultural differences. Elena mimicked his demonstration, bringing the nebulizer closer to Jamie's face while trying to remember everything she'd observed during their previous emergency room visits. The plastic mask felt cold against her palm, its edges designed to conform to small facial features, but she couldn't tell if she was positioning it correctly. Jamie's breathing was so shallow now that she wasn't sure the medication would reach his lungs even if she managed to create the right seal. Marcus pulled out his phone and activated its flashlight function, aiming the bright LED at Elena's hands to give her better visibility. In the improved lighting, she could see the nebulizer's components more clearly: the medication chamber where the mist originated, the flexible tubing that connected to the mask, the small indicator lights that showed the device was functioning properly. The technology was more sophisticated than anything she could have afforded, but its basic operation seemed straightforward enough. Elena positioned the mask over Jamie's nose and mouth, adjusting the elastic straps that would hold it in place once she was confident about the fit. His skin felt burning hot against her fingers, fever adding another layer of complexity to his respiratory crisis. She'd learned to monitor his temperature during asthma attacks, knew that the combination of oxygen deprivation and bodily stress often triggered high fevers that could become dangerous in their own right. Marcus watched Jamie's chest rise and fall beneath the nebulizer mask, noting the subtle changes that indicated the medication was beginning to reach his airways. The boy's breathing remained labored, but there was a slight improvement in the Bayou rhythm, a marginally less desperate quality to each inhalation. Albuterol typically took several minutes to show significant effects, but even small improvements could mean the difference between stabilization and complete respiratory failure. Elena felt Jamie's body respond to the treatment with microscopic changes that only a mother would notice. His muscles relaxed fractionally against her chest. His heartbeat shifted from the frantic rhythm of oxygen starvation towards something more sustainable. She'd learned to read these subtle signals over 4 years of medical emergencies, had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the indicators that meant improvement or deterioration. Marcus reached into his medical bag again, this time extracting a pulse oximeter that would give them objective measurements of Jamie's oxygen saturation levels. The small device clipped onto fingertips and used light sensors to determine how much oxygen was actually reaching the bloodstream, providing crucial data about whether the nebulizer treatment was working effectively. He held it up for Elena to see, then pointed to his own finger to demonstrate its use. Elena watched him clip the device onto his index finger, observing how the small screen lit up with numbers that changed as he breathed normally. She didn't understand the specific measurements, but the concept was clear enough: the device would tell them whether Jamie was getting enough oxygen to survive. When Marcus offered her the pulse oximeter, she carefully transferred it to Jamie's tiny finger, marveling at how the technology seemed almost magical in its ability to peer inside her son's body. The numbers on the screen fluctuated wildly at first, probably due to Jamie's unstable condition and the device's need to calibrate to his specific physiology. Elena stared at the display, watching digits rise and fall without understanding what they meant but knowing instinctively that higher numbers were better. Marcus leaned closer, careful not to invade her space, and pointed to different parts of the readout while speaking slowly in English she was beginning to recognize. Marcus showed her the target range they needed to achieve, pointing to numbers on the device and then to Jamie's face, helping her understand the connection between the digital measurements and her son's physical symptoms. Oxygen saturation below 90% meant serious trouble. Below 80% meant life-threatening emergency, and Jamie's current reading hovered dangerously close to the lower threshold. Elena absorbed this information with the focused intensity of someone whose child's life depended on understanding medical technology she'd never encountered before. She'd always been quick to learn new things, a skill that had served her well in adapting to life in America, but she'd never had to master life support equipment under hurricane conditions with a dying child in her arms. The storm outside seemed to intensify as they worked, as if Delilah had sensed their small bubble of hope and decided to test their resolve. Rain hammered against the gas station's remaining windows with enough force to crack the glass, while wind found every structural weakness and exploited it mercilessly. The building groaned and shifted around them, creating a symphony of destruction that threatened to drown out the quiet hum of the nebulizer. Marcus checked his watch, timing the nebulizer treatment while monitoring Jamie's response to the medication. Albuterol typically showed its peak effects within 10 to 15 minutes, but children's systems could be unpredictable, especially when dealing with severe attacks complicated by environmental stressors. He'd seen cases where the medication worked miracles, opening airways that had seemed permanently constricted. But he'd also witnessed situations where even the strongest bronchodilators couldn't overcome the underlying pathology. Elena felt Jamie stir against her chest, a small movement that sent hope flooding through her exhausted system. His eyelids fluttered, not fully opening but showing signs of responsiveness that had been absent for hours. She whispered to him in Spanish, telling him that help had arrived, that he needed to keep fighting, that Mama was right there with him through whatever came next. Marcus observed the interaction between mother and child, noting how Elena's voice seemed to calm Jamie even in his unconscious state. The bond between them was obvious, strengthened by years of facing medical crises together, deepened by the shared experience of navigating a healthcare system that wasn't designed for people in their situation. Whatever fears Elena had about trusting him, her love for Jamie was overriding her survival instincts. The pulse oximeter began showing more stable readings as the nebulizer treatment progressed, numbers climbing slowly but steadily toward the safe range. Elena watched the display with the intensity of someone reading prophecy, understanding that each improved digit represented another step back from the edge of losing her son forever. Marcus saw her shoulders relax slightly as the measurements improved, the first sign that she was beginning to believe they might actually survive this nightmare. Elena looked up from the device to find Marcus watching her with an expression she'd rarely seen from medical professionals, genuine emotional investment in the outcome. Most doctors and nurses maintain professional distance, treating Jamie's condition as a clinical challenge rather than a human tragedy. But this man's face showed the kind of personal concern usually reserved for family members, the deep empathy that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. Marcus realized he was holding his breath as he watched Jamie's condition slowly stabilize, his own heart rate elevated by the adrenaline of emergency medicine and the personal connection he felt to this mother's desperate fight to save her child. His divorce had taught him how quickly family bonds could shatter, how easily the people you loved most could slip away despite your best efforts to hold them close. Watching Elena's fierce determination to protect Jamie reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything that still mattered. The nebulizer's medication chamber was nearly empty now, its mist production slowing as the albuterol supply reached its end. Elena noticed the change immediately, panic flashing across her features as she realized their lifeline was running out. But Marcus was already reaching into his bag for a second dose, a backup supply that could extend the treatment if Jamie's condition hadn't stabilized sufficiently. Elena accepted the replacement medication with hands that no longer shook, her movements more confident now that she understood the equipment and could see it working. The trust she was placing in this stranger went against every survival lesson she'd learned since arriving in America. But Jamie's improving oxygen levels provided evidence that maybe, just maybe, some people could be trusted to help without demanding payment she couldn't afford. Marcus watched her reload the nebulizer with growing respect for her quick learning ability and fierce maternal devotion. Whatever circumstances had brought her to this abandoned gas station during a hurricane, whatever fears kept her from seeking official help, she was proving herself capable of anything necessary to save her son's life. In his experience, that kind of determination usually found a way to succeed against impossible odds. The storm raged on outside their fragile shelter. But inside the gas station, something fundamental had shifted. A mother had chosen to trust a stranger with her child's life, and that stranger was proving worthy of the faith she'd placed in him. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of Delilah's fury. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.